Now here's the amazing story of one man's vision to build the world's biggest flying boat. Here's Dream to Fly.
The world's largest plane and storm center of a congressional inquiry awaits tests at its dock in Long Beach, California. Builder of the monster, Howard Hughes, stormy petrel of aviation, surveys the 320-foot wing of the Colossus, whose weight is 200 tons and whose length is 200 feet. Sections of the mammoth are as high as a 5-story building. Mr. Hughes' descent gives you an idea.
A proven technological marvel, yet hailed as a white elephant of epic proportions by the American taxpayer. The building of Howard Hughes's flying boat was a tale of one man, a maverick up to the challenge of building it, and an era of American history at the confluence of industry and ingenuity, folly and passion, and global war. In 1939, people were dying as the European theatre of war expanded. War, not restricted to land, was the domain of submarine U-boats, aggressively manufactured in the name of Nazi world dominance. In September 1939, the Germans' war machine launched an all-out assault on the shipping lanes of the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships by the dozen, killing soldiers and civilians, and crippling the economies and defense efforts of European allies. Between January and July 1942, German U-boats destroyed over 200,000 tons of cargo and 681 Allied ships from 26 nations, including the United States. Vanquishing this terrible underwater threat and maintaining the transport of men, women, and materials was vital to the survival of free Europe. This was also the preoccupation of West Coast industrialist Henry J. Kaiser. Beginning in March of 1941, under the leadership of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the United States provided Lend-Lease aid to Britain and her allies. Under this program, Kaiser pulled off the extraordinary achievement of mass-producing the Liberty ships that became the workhorses of Allied war transport. However, anxious over the rising destruction of his Liberty ships by U-boats, Kaiser pitched an idea to the War Production Board to mass-produce an armada of flying boats that would create an air bridge for the transportation of troops and supplies for the war effort. There were, however, obstacles. Kaiser's new and innovative idea met with skepticism from the aviation industry, but, regardless, searched for support from someone more willing to embrace new ideas. He found a businessman known not only for his innovative thinking and aviation genius, but also for his daredevil exploits and dynamic personality. The man was Howard Hughes. Born on Christmas Eve, 1905, Howard Hughes was the son of Howard Hughes Sr. The two became known as Big and Little Howard. Howard the Elder effectively revolutionized the oil drilling industry. His pioneering drill bit design allowed oilmen to get to rich deposits by penetrating thick rock formations. Wealthy from the proceeds of his tool bit invention, the senior Hughes established the Hughes Tool Company. Little Howard showed the same aptitude for mechanical engineering as his father. When Hughes Sr. died in 1924, he left his company and wealth to his son. Soon afterwards, the young Hughes moved to pastures new and joined his movie-producing uncle Rupert Hughes in California. It was during the filming of Hell's Angels that the passion for flying enveloped Hughes. By 1928, he had achieved both his private and commercial pilot's rating. A desire to improve his aeroplanes drove him to aircraft design and engineering. He made a name for himself as a brilliant engineer and a larger-than-life, record-breaking test pilot. Flying his H-1 Racer, Hughes set a record of 352 miles an hour in 1935.
This speed field is not a very appropriate setting for this little airplane, which is the new holder of the world's land plane speed record. Its forced landing here was caused by motor failure while it was being clocked by the National Aeronautical Association at an average speed of approximately 350 miles an hour, ample to surpass the old record of 314 held by the French. At the time the motor failed, it was traveling approximately 370. Failure was caused by faulty fuel supply system.
He went on to establish a new coast-to-coast record of 7 hours and 28 minutes. These and other accomplishments gained him national attention and awards, including 2 Harmon trophies, the Collier Trophy, and in 1941, a presidential citation for his round-the-world flight of 1938.
Greatest record established in the history of aviation. I know you're tired. Congratulations. Welcome home. That's for the entire crew.
Thank you. I really should extend to these other men rather than me.
Among the leaders of the aviation world, Hero Hughes was universally mandated to answer his nation's call. Hughes was intrigued with Kaiser's plan for the flying boat and motivated by the idea of designing the world's largest aeroplane. By late August 1942, the pair reached a handshake agreement and an understanding that Hughes would design a flying boat and Kaiser would build it. Zealous to spread the word, Kaiser informed the press of the agreement. However, when the news made the headlines, his new partner's ambitious construction schedule caused Hughes great consternation. But the course had already been charted. 3 flying boat cargo planes were ordered, 1 for static testing and 2 for flying. The US government allocated $18 million. By November 1942, the project was underway. But beyond the setting up of the Kaiser-Hughes Corporation, Hughes and Kaiser rarely came into contact. Despite the formal contract terms, the practicalities of engineering and constructing the flying boat lay with Hughes. The flying boat prototype, called the HK-1 after Hughes and Kaiser, benefited from no design precedents for Hughes and his team to follow. Such a steep learning curve meant they had to design and build new machines and devise new methods of mechanical engineering. A twin-boom aircraft was considered at first, but later abandoned in favor of a single-hull flying boat capable of carrying 2 30-ton tanks with a full complement of armor and crew, or 3 light tanks and equipment. In 1940, President Roosevelt established a list of materials critical to the war effort and placed severe restrictions on private and commercial construction. Neither Hughes, Kaiser, nor their companies would collect fees or profit from the project. The aircraft could not be constructed from strategic wartime materials such as aluminium. They could use no engineers, technicians, or other skilled personnel from companies already occupied in the war effort.
When he couldn't get aluminum from the government during the war or beginning of the war to build airplanes, he built them out of wood. And that's, I admire the guy. You couldn't say no to Howard Hughes.
Between 1942 and 1946, more than 800 woodworkers from the United Brotherhood of Carpenters joined Hughes to assist with the flying boat project.
People that go up to the North Country Idaho, Oregon, looking for lumber. They cut down these big trees. They would peel them all out. If they found a knot, they'd throw it away. They picked the best wood in the forests of the United States to build that airplane.
No hangar existed that was large enough to house the flying boat's construction. So Hughes ordered a special hangar to be built at the Hughes aircraft plant in Culver City, California. Building number 15, or the cargo building, became the signature structure at the aircraft plant. The giant double-gabled hangar stretched to 100 feet tall, 742 feet long, and 248 feet wide, the equivalent of the area taken up by 2 large aircraft carriers.
It was the 3rd of March in '43, as I recall, that we started laying out the boat on the floor. From the line drawings that we received from Hughes, which had dates on them, design dates on them of 1937 and 1938. So taking these drawings, we interpreted them into how this aircraft would be made and laid out the information on the floor in points, mathematically developed.
The birch parts were made from veneer varying in thickness, laminated together by workers with special glue. Because of the great lengths of most parts, it was necessary to tie the ends of the veneers together before lamination. Birch billets for the wing spars were 6 inches wide by 8 inches thick and 90 feet long.
The system is very involved, but we had to calculate every move of that and then put it down on the floor, scribe it into the floor, and mark it and number it, so that every rib and every piece that was going to make up the aircraft had to be defined numerically. Having those done, why the edges of all of the pieces of the skin were now defined. This means that they could make plaster molds that met using these templates that would form the wood into these shapes.
Duramold was a bonding process of pressure shaping wood and plastic materials together.
The average person thinks that a wood airplane can be made by going to a lumber yard and buy plywood and 2x4s and throwing them together and call it an airplane. That is not possible. Duramold came about as a means of getting as much strength out of wood as possible.
It was the first time that Duramold had ever been used on anything this large. So there was a great deal of lack of knowledge as to what the result would be when you got into these huge ribs and so on. How stable would they be? And they turned out to be quite stable, as a matter of fact.
Over a 3-year period, Hughes workers conducted extensive tests on wood-constructed joints and improved the Duramold process. They subjected the joints to a wide range of tests which showed no deterioration. The final design of this aircraft called for 8 3,000 horsepower engines and wings 20 feet longer than a football field. After addressing the challenges of size and material, Hughes focused on sourcing the engines to use on the seaplane. Here he met another dilemma. No engines existed that could lift an aeroplane with a gross payload of 400,000 pounds. Eventually, Pratt & Whitney issued a new corncob engine design. The R4360 was installed. Eight of these 3,000 horsepower engines were fitted onto his flying boat. This plant achieved the equivalent power of 7 wartime-era locomotives. Hughes and engineers from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, performed wind tunnel and towing tank tests on scale models of the aircraft. The tests ensured that the flying boat would be both aero and hydrodynamic. Aluminium was again available for use in non-strategic aircraft. The War Production Board reviewed the flying boat project in early 1944. At issue was the material used in the aircraft's construction. Was wood construction really strong enough to withstand a 400,000-pound payload? Would the aircraft be better if constructed in metal? In a letter to the review committee, Hughes argued that if it was a mistake to start construction on the aircraft, it would be a bigger mistake to stop its construction altogether. Hughes prevailed in March 1944, and the contract continued, but without Henry Kaiser. In its decision to continue the contract, the government stated that completion of the project was no longer necessary for the war effort. Hughes could build the prototype under the terms of the original contract, but her sister ships were unnecessary. By Germany's surrender on May the 8th, 1945, the Hughes flying boat was still in pieces and under construction at Culver City. By now, the project had been underway for 3.5 years. With the dissolution of the Kaiser Hughes Corporation and as a result of an employee naming contest, the seaplane underwent a name change from HK-1 to Hercules. The name was short-lived, however, and she became known simply as the Hughes H-4 flying boat. In June, Hughes unveiled the aeroplane, and news about the enormous aircraft hit the headlines of newspapers across the country. Hughes secured a graving dock site on Terminal Island at Long Beach, and by June 1946, it was readied for the flying boat's arrival. On June the 11th, 1946, star movers slowly moved the 160-foot wing sections, the flaps, vertical tail, and other components out of building number 15 and away from the Culver City plant. Engineers assured Hughes the roadbeds could withstand the weight of the heavy sections. Utility crews lifted more than 2,000 power lines so the caravan could pass. Schools broke up for the day with a crowd of more than 100,000 lining the road for the procession. By the end of summer, the large pieces began to look like an aircraft of mammoth proportions. Little by little, workers installed the electrical, hydraulic, and control systems that would bring life to the giant aeroplane. Criticism of the project escalated in Washington as the Hughes team assembled the flying boat in the Long Beach dry dock. In the meantime, Hughes was ready to flight test the other aircraft he had built under government contract. The XF-11 was an experimental photo reconnaissance aircraft with great capabilities. It had a twin-boom design and aluminium construction. On July the 7th, 1946, filling up with 1,200 gallons of fuel, twice the recommended amount, Hughes taxied the aircraft down the runway for flight testing. He had been flying for about 40 minutes when a hydraulic leak in the counter-rotating blades of the propeller system caused the XF-11 to crash. The extra fuel resulted in a fiery explosion. Hughes barely escaped with his life. Members of the War Production Board continued to monitor the flying boat's progress. The prototype had exceeded the government's funding allowance. Although Hughes promised to pay for the cost overruns out of his own pocket, federal politicians again tried to cancel the project. A Senate investigation committee headed by Maine Senator Owen Brewster probed alleged profiteering by Hughes in his wartime contracts for the XF-11 and the flying boat. But the question of other motives for Brewster preoccupied Hughes.
So I ask you this question again, Senator Brewster. During my last trip to Washington, and while we were having lunch in your suite at the Mayflower Hotel, did you or did you not offer to call off this entire investigation if I would agree to merge TWA Trans World Airline with your friend Juan Tripp's Pan American Airways?
$40 million has been paid by the government to the Hughes Aviation Company, and nothing has been thus far received. Investigation of this matter was commenced by Senator Truman as chairman of the committee 4 years ago, and has been continued in recent months under Senator Ferguson and at his insistence. There has never been any discussion of discontinuing the investigation so far as my knowledge goes, or that of any member of the committee. What became of the $40 million is what we want to know.
In the meantime, Brewster took his attacks on Hughes and his aeroplanes to the press, which increased public interest in the Senate investigation.
If you read that terrible testimony by Senator Brewster, where he called it a flying lumberyard, and all those things, did you write it? It was easy to do it. The war was over. Metal was being produced all over the world. It's easy to go back and say Hughes didn't have to do that. He did. He did have to do it. The fact that he only built one, we only wanted one. The fact that he did the F-11, a great airplane. The war was over. But we forget to go back in time and say, when we need them, they were there.
Public awareness of the investigation was acute by the time Hughes appeared in Washington for his testimony before the Senate committee. On the afternoon of August the 6th, 1947, Hughes and his entourage entered the Senate office building and continued to the caucus room for the hearing. A standing room only crowd had gathered for the proceeding, complete with plenty of media coverage.
Will you just raise your right hand to be sworn? You do solemnly swear in the matter now pending before this committee?
I do.
Just have a chair.
The committee accused Hughes of using government money for expenses not related to his aircraft contracts. To illustrate the point, and to take a swipe at Roosevelt, Senator Ferguson questioned Hughes about his public relations man, Johnny Mayer, who had entertained the president's son, Colonel Elliott Roosevelt. What followed was an extraordinary exchange between the Senate committee and a pugnacious Hughes.
May I ask a question?
Well, now, if you'll just wait till I issue a subpoena for Mr. Mars, I've asked you whether or not you would produce him, and you said you didn't know, as I understand it.
I don't remember if that was my answer.
Well, what was your answer?
I don't remember. Get it off the record.
Well, now, Mr. Hughes, I'm asking you what your answer was. And we're not going to have this bickering back and forth. You are before this committee, and you're going to answer the question.
You asked me just now about a reply that I made. My answer is I don't remember. Now, the man is taking it down there.
Well, I'll ask you again.
What?
Will you bring Mr. Mars in at the 2 o'clock session?
No, I don't think I will.
Will you try to bring him in?
No, I don't think I'll try.
All right. Truth, so help you God.
I do, Senator.
Just have a chair. Now, you paid a man by the name of Chick Farmer $50 to stop publicity of Roosevelt in New York, and that was Colonel Roosevelt, was it?
That's right.
Now, you said that could be explained very easily. Will you explain it?
We were in the El Morocco Club there, and a photographer started to take our picture. Mr. Roosevelt said he didn't care to have his picture taken. This fellow rather insisted on it, and I talked to Mr. Farmer, who was the publicity director of El Morocco, and he said he would see that it did not appear. And I gave him $50 to see that it didn't appear.
And there are efforts to find out whether there was any connection that I might have had with the chief executive, which might have had an effect on any war contracts. And I'm here to give you the complete facts.
The accusations irritated Hughes.
When Senator Brewster realized that he was fighting a battle against public opinion, a losing battle, he folded up and took a run-out powder. Yes, that was the tip-off. When Senator Brewster hit the road for the backwoods of Maine, that meant the hearing was over. Washington was too hot for him. He couldn't take it. After that,
the other senators in this committee saw no reason why they should fight Brewster's losing battle for him if he was too cowardly to remain and face the music. They saw no reason to carry his banner against an overwhelming avalanche of public opinion.
All right.
I've put the sweat of my life into this thing. I have my reputation rolled up in it. And I have stated several times that if it's a failure, I'll probably leave this country and never come back, and I mean it.
Cars could do it for wash it.
Defiant of speculative Senate scrutiny, Hughes quickly departed Washington for California and set about demonstrating the capability of both the XF-11 and his flying boat to Senators Brewster and Ferguson. Delayed slightly by weather, he ordered his flying boat out of dry dock for taxi testing. Reporter James McNamara's scoop on November the 2nd, 1947, was Hughes's moment of truth.
This is James McNamara speaking to you from aboard the Howard Hughes 2,000-ton flying boat, the world's largest aircraft. Right now, Howard Hughes is at the wheel control, and he's nursing this aeronautical wonder on its maiden taxi run. Might add that it's a beautiful day out here off the coast of Southern California. Crystal blue skies, a warm sun, a slight spanking breeze from the northwest, and a relatively calm sea protected by the breakwater of the outer harbor. Huge crowds jammed the surrounding shoreline this morning when this gargantuan ship was first towed into the outer harbor. And right now, an armada of water taxis, PT boats, and private vessels are accompanying the Hughes ship on this running course this afternoon. Now we're plowing along at about 50 knots as we can gauge the speed. It feels like we're riding a souped-up ocean liner. That's about as close a simile as I can think of right now. There are 30 passengers aboard today, including the crew and members of press and radio. Howard, do you have time at this moment to explain for our radio listeners exactly what you're doing, the operation? Yes, that was right around 90 miles an hour. We were well up on the step, and the airplane could have lifted off easily if I just pulled back on the control, I'm sure, but we have so many mechanical devices in this ship right now that I want to check a few of them out a little bit before we try anything like that. And as I say, I previously estimated it'll be March or April before we're really ready to fly this airplane. This is James McNamara speaking to you from the cabin of the giant Hughes aircraft once again. Howard Hughes has just alerted us. He has asked everyone to hold on, and he'll get all 8 engines moving. Tremendous horsepower kicking up. Howard is sitting directly in front of us, holding on to his seat. Here we go. Here we go. The airspeed indicator has moved up to 25. It's 30. It's 35. As he pushes the throttle, it's 40. It's 45. More throttle. It's 45. It's 50. It's 50 over a choppy sea. It's 55. It's 55. More throttle. It's 60. It bounces to 65. It's 70. It's 75. And something momentarily he cuts out, and I believe we are airborne. We are airborne, ladies and gentlemen. And I don't believe that Howard Hughes meant this to me. I don't know. We were airborne, and we were really up in the air. We were really up in the air. And I don't know whether Howard, did you expect that? Certainly, I like to make surprises. You were surprised or not? Oh, I said I thought I'd make a surprise. Well, it certainly surprised the people here.
A momentous day for aviation and the flight crew.
Mr. Hughes informed me that he would be using the transmission from there on. So I moved to my station, which was the electrical control panel.
There were 2 of us actually at the panel. At the last minute, we decided that I didn't have enough hands to handle it all. So my boss agreed to sit with me, and between us, we handled the flight engineer station.
Johnny Glenn was responsible for the auxiliary power units. And I had informed him that I wanted to keep them on all the time. But I wouldn't have them on the line until I thought it was necessary.
Merle didn't have enough power, and he kept giving me the sign and hollering at me. I could hear him, but I gave him all I had there. That's all. I had it screwed tight, as we call it. And it just wasn't enough at the time.
Well, on taxi run number 2, Mr. Hughes, from taxiing, asked the co-pilot to give him about 3 to 5 degrees of flap. And when he did that, we lifted off of the step. On the 3rd taxi, we felt it lift off of the step, and we were airborne, but we could feel it. It was very quiet.
Howard pulled the throttles back as soon as it come off the water, but we were up in the air pretty high then. And of course I didn't know that because I couldn't see out.
When he lifted off, the right wing seemed to dip. And then he overcorrected with his control. The left wing went down slightly.
And about that time I looked around at Howard, and Howard was working the elevators like they were going to come out of the floor. He didn't have any hydraulic power because he had pulled the throttles back. So we didn't have an auxiliary hydraulic system then.
Then he brought it back to an even, and it was fine for landing. And we were all elated and pat each other on the back and said, hey, we did the job. And wonder what's next.
Sometime, either just before or just after the flight, the Hughes flying boat acquired its most famous moniker, Spruce Goose. Nonetheless, Howard Hughes didn't like it.
You used HFB, HK1, H4, whatever, but do not use Spruce Goose. This was something that Howard did not like, and it was made quite obvious to us.
After flying her, Hughes had the flying boat placed in her graving dock and ordered a special climate-controlled hangar to be built over and around her, which he maintained at a cost of about $1 million a year. She remained at Terminal Island over the next 30 years, in seclusion but not hibernation. Her crew immediately set to work making system changes based on the data gathered during the taxi tests and short flight. Engineers made improvements on her flight control systems.
After the flight, we sat down with Howard and Mr. Hughes, and he said, I'll give you so long, I want this, and that fixed, and I'll give you so long. And we did it, and did it in a hurry.
The modification that I was most familiar with was the hydraulic system we put in, the auxiliary hydraulic. There was no auxiliary hydraulic in the original airplane.
Present-day airliners have controls that are very similar to what was developed on the HFB-1, Spruce Goose. So, in a way, the development of the Hughes flying boat contributed to modern-day designs of airliners.
Redundancy is something that the flying boat, I think, was probably the very first in having backup systems for the control surfaces, rudder, elevator, and aileron.
Hughes and the Navy agreed to an exchange of the engines, the R-4360, to a newer, later updated engine.
And we had to take them off once and take them all into Pacific Aeromotive and have some changes made. God, we had them off and on, I don't know how many times. Pratt Whitney would send out a change, so we'd have to pull the engines off and send them over to Pacific Aeromotive in Burbank and get it changed, then bring them back and hang them up again. So we were busy all the time.
If an engine fell off, they had to be concerned about whether the hydraulic plumbing would rip away some of the structure. So there were devices for breaking the plumbing that would break away if the engine fell. And that affected the hydraulic lines and the fire suppression lines.
Her flight deck and interior design led to changes in other large capacity aircraft.
That's why the aircraft was considered to be an icon in aviation history, because so many things that were developed that went on to allow us to make big airplanes and make them successfully were the result of much of the work that was done here.
I think that the flying boat has contributed quite a bit to aviation in general. It really was the beginning of all subsequent flight control systems, and really was something to be proud of.
In exchange for the racer, Hughes received full title of his beloved flying boat in 1974.
He didn't hesitate at all about the racer. It is a great airplane. They give him that. But the flying boat, he never wanted to give. But of all of his treasures, aerodynamic treasures, that's the most important.
But there was a catch. When Hughes died, workers would dismantle the flying boat into 9 pieces unless a non-profit organization took custody of her. After Hughes passed away in 1976, the lease on the graving dock hangar at the Port of Long Beach expired. With no non-profit organization to take her, Suma Corporation, Hughes's holding company, made plans to dismantle the historic seaplane. Hughes's old friend Jack Reel tried to find a new home for her.
I would have taken it to Destin, Pensacola, any place. I had to get that airplane taken care of. I didn't want to cut it up.
Arrangements were made for Suma to donate the aircraft to the non-profit Aero Club of Southern California, which would then lease it to the Rather Corporation, headed by entrepreneur Jack Rather and his wife Bonita Granville Rather, a former Hollywood movie star. Rather Corporation pledged enough money to move the flying boat to a temporary location while they built a dome in which to properly display her. Rather had just picked up the master lease on the RMS Queen Mary, berthed in Long Beach. He felt that the world's largest aeroplane would make an exciting addition to the project. On October the 29th, 1980, the flying boat emerged from seclusion and into the world's spotlight. The world's largest floating crane, Hermann the German, lifted her onto the dock of the temporary storage area. After 16 months, the new dome was ready. Floating by barge, the flying boat moved across the Long Beach harbor, then gently eased into her new home adjacent to the Queen Mary. In the late 1980s, after the deaths of Jack and Bonita Rather, the Disney Corporation purchased the former holdings of the Rather Corporation. In March 1990, Disney informed the Aero Club of Southern California of its intention to discontinue the dome exhibit, leaving the flying boat looking for yet another home. In 1992, the Aero Club of Southern California began requesting proposals for custody and preservation of the aircraft. Organizations submitting proposals had to meet 2 criteria: access to land on which to house the flying boat, and the funding necessary to move and care for her.
Far and away, the Evergreen proposal was the best of all of the proposals we received. I mean, nobody was even close.
Evergreen's plan, as envisioned by Captain Michael King Smith, proposed not only to preserve and protect her, but also to display her as the central exhibit in a living museum.
When Evergreen was named the recipient of the flying boat, we were very impressed when a bevy of technicians and executives came from Marana and began taking apart the flying boat. Nobody knew where it came apart and how it came apart. The last time it was put together was in 1946, and it hadn't been disturbed since. And so it became a real challenge to disassemble.
A large opening was created in the dome, and the remains were shrink-wrapped and rolled out onto an ocean-going barge. After traveling 980 nautical miles, the flying boat arrived in Portland, Oregon. From there, the flying boat made the short journey to McMinnville at Evergreen International Aviation on February the 27th, 1993.
That distance from Culver City to Long Beach was approximately 26 miles. So went overland for 26 miles, was assembled in Long Beach, and flew for a mile. So that's a total of 27 miles. So the distance from Long Beach to McMinnville, Oregon was the longest trip the flying boat ever took, ever.
Shortly after the successful arrival in McMinnville, museum co-founder Captain Michael King Smith tragically died as the result of a car accident. Delford, father to Michael King Smith, persevered and continued his son's dream of an educational institute and living museum.
It was Mike's dream to build a museum, and it was Mike's dream to acquire the HK-1, the Hughes flying boat.
Being a taxi driver in this city, you take the rough with the smooth. Her dream is to
With characteristic tenacity, the 60-year-old project continued as dedicated crews of volunteers restored the flying boat exterior in Evergreen's temporary storage area.
They had 47,000 square feet of paint that needed to be scraped off and sanded and recoated. I spent many hours down here leading the volunteers in a restoration process.
So by the time we got down to the wood and we got started sanding, well, we began to see these signatures all over the hull.
The paint removal exposed inspection stamps, signatures of men and women who worked on the original construction, and evidence that the wood laminate had passed wind shear tests. The crew sanded the large pieces of the flying boat, primed them with a white latex finish, and repainted them in the original flight color of silver.
Our major goal was to preserve and restore the flying boat back to the same condition and configuration that it was in on the day when it was out in 1947 for taxi tests and when it flew.
Preparations began for the final 800-foot move from temporary storage to the new 121,000 square foot museum building. It took just over a year to reassemble the flying boat. Preparing for the arrival of the fuselage, workers positioned the wings on the right and left, just as they had in 1946. Before assembly, the crew lowered the fuselage and its cradle into a 7-foot pit at the museum. Volunteers assembled the wings and vertical tail first, followed a short time later by the assembly of the pylons.
The challenges of hanging the engines were being able to move the engine while a person was standing in a man lift. So placing the engine on the firewall proved to be more challenging than we thought. However, once we had a routine down of getting the first one done, the rest were installed in no time at all. Replacing the fabric on the control surfaces was a monumental task. Thousands of knots had to be sewn. The ailerons were restored right here on the floor while we were still assembling portions of the aircraft. They're 71 feet long, and we used 2 pieces of fabric for each aileron. 1 piece of fabric on top and 1 piece of fabric on the bottom.
The propellers came to us boxed, literally in crates, disassembled. So one of the major projects, in addition to installing engines, was to reassemble these propellers. And we've actually put them back together in the same order and blades in the same position that they were in when it was installed in the Hughes hangar.
They painted and prepared the propellers, attached them to the aircraft, and completed the assembly of the horizontal stabilizers in time for the new museum facilities opening on June the 6th, 2001. On December the 7th, 2001, the 60th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, crews assembled the tail cone, signifying the completion of the flying boat's incredible journey.
And I felt like we were writing the last words in a chapter of aviation world history.
And with the final drive of her engines, 200 tons are airborne, 5 months ahead of time. 70 feet off the water, she stays for a mile. $23 million worth of airplane has answered a lot of committee questions. It can fly.
The flying boat is still the largest wooden aircraft ever built. A legacy is the story of a nation's desire to protect freedom at a time of war. A calling to all members of society, both millionaires and ordinary people. She tells the story of sacrifice, determination, and technological developments that embody the pioneering spirit of great aviators like Howard Hughes. Since its conception in the dark days of the Second World War, this aircraft has followed the locum of Howard Hughes's remarkable aptitude for aircraft design. Hughes's flying boat has endured many hardships to become a popular and important cultural artifact of American aviation, revolutionizing modern flight with her size and lift capacity. Howard Hughes's dreams of advances in aviation, developed but not realized in his lifetime, remain enduring symbols that continue to spur the dream to fly.
This airplane, from any point of view you take a look at it, certainly must be a picture of the world in which perhaps we're going to live tomorrow. Promising and awesome, tragic and inspiring, it's got everything, and I just hope it flies.
The ultimate motor mouth mechanic.